The road out of the frozen mountains did not look like victory, but it would become one of the most remembered survival stories in American military history. In late 1950, around the Chosin Reservoir in North Korea, United States Marines and other United Nations command forces found themselves in a landscape that seemed almost designed to break organization, confidence, and endurance. The temperature fell far below freezing, sometimes described in later accounts as reaching levels near 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Weapons, vehicles, radios, medical supplies, engines, hands, boots, and even simple decisions were affected by the cold. The mountains rose around narrow roads. Snow covered the ground. The reservoir sat in a remote, harsh region where movement depended on a few fragile routes, and every mile could become a test of command discipline. For many Americans back home, the Korean War had seemed, only weeks earlier, as if it might be approaching a quick conclusion. After the landing at Incheon, the recapture of Seoul, and the advance northward, confidence spread through military and political circles. United Nations command forces had pushed deep into North Korea, and some believed the war might soon end before winter fully settled in. But the mountains around Chosin would expose the danger of that confidence. The war was not ending. It was changing shape. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army had entered the conflict in force, and its intervention turned the American advance into a crisis that shocked the United States. What followed was not a simple retreat in the ordinary sense. It was a fighting withdrawal through frozen mountain roads, under pressure from Chinese Ninth Army forces, with air supply, road control, engineering, and command discipline becoming the difference between collapse and survival. The record suggests that one of the central figures in this story was Major General Oliver P. Smith, the commander of the 1st Marine Division. Smith was not remembered because he rushed blindly into danger or because he turned the story into a dramatic legend at the moment it happened. He is remembered because, as the situation worsened, his division remained organized enough to move, hold together, and continue down the road toward the coast. Opposite him in the wider campaign was General Song Shirluan, commander of the Chinese Ninth Army, whose forces brought immense pressure into the frozen mountains and helped create the encirclement crisis around the reservoir. These two commanders represented two different systems of war meeting in extreme conditions. One built around marine discipline, air support, supply coordination, and an organized withdrawal. The other built around sudden intervention, mountain movement, pressure on separated units, and the ability to transform a freezing landscape into a battlefield of encirclement. To understand why this story shook America, the viewer has to begin before the withdrawal itself, when the United States and its allies believed momentum was on their side. The Korean War had begun in June 1950 when North Korean forces crossed into South Korea, triggering a rapid international response under the United Nations. The early months were chaotic and dangerous, but the landing at Incheon in September changed the war's direction. United Nations command forces broke out, regained ground, and pushed north. In the months that followed, the campaign moved toward the border region with China, and the belief that the war might be nearly over became increasingly powerful. That belief shaped decisions, expectations, and the pace of advance. Yet maps can create dangerous confidence when they hide the reality of mountains, weather, roads, and supply. North Korea in late autumn was not only a military theater. It was a vast environmental challenge. Roads were limited. Distances were difficult. The cold arrived with punishing force. The mountains did not allow easy coordination across separated columns. The farther the advance moved north, the more stretched and vulnerable the system became. Around Chosin Reservoir, this problem became extreme. Units were positioned across places that would become central to the story. Utamanai, Hagaru-ri, Koto-ri, and the narrow road south through Funchilin Pass. These names were not famous to most Americans then, but they would become markers of endurance. They were not just dots on a map. They were lifelines in a frozen corridor. If the road held, the force could move. If the road broke, everything became harder. If air supply arrived, the command could continue to function. If the weather closed in, the margin narrowed. If the divisions of the force became too separated, pressure could turn geography into a trap. This is why the word retreat does not fully explain what happened. A retreat can sound like disorder or defeat. At Chosin, the reality was more complex. The Marines and attached forces had to withdraw while preserving structure, protecting movement, managing supplies, and keeping the road open through a hostile winter landscape. Later Marine memory would capture this through the idea that they were not simply retreating, they were attacking in another direction. That phrase reflects the pride of the force, but the deeper explanation is more practical. The withdrawal had to remain organized, or the cold, distance, and pressure could destroy the ability to move. Major General Oliver P. Smith's caution before and during the crisis mattered because he understood that in mountain warfare, spacing, supply, roads, and airfields can be as decisive as any single clash. Hagaru-ri became especially important because it served as a central point for coordination and air support. From there, the ability to receive supplies, evacuate personnel, repair equipment, and maintain communication helped keep the campaign from becoming a complete disaster. But none of this was guaranteed. The cold made everything slower. Fuel thickened. Vehicles struggled. Radios and batteries suffered. Frostbite and exposure became constant concerns, and even ordinary tasks could demand extraordinary effort. A canteen, a ration, a rifle part, a vehicle engine, or a radio wire could become part of the survival equation. In this environment, the Chinese intervention had a psychological force as well as a military one. For Americans who had expected the war to be moving toward conclusion, the sudden realization that large Chinese forces were now involved changed the entire meaning of the campaign. The enemy was no longer only the North Korean army that had been driven back after Incheon. The war had widened. The confidence of October and early November gave way to the shock of winter crisis. The mountains around Chosin became the place where American assumptions met a new reality. General Song Sherluin's Ninth Army brought pressure across the region, and the Chinese People's Volunteer Army used surprise, numbers, movement, and terrain to challenge the extended United Nations advance. A balanced documentary must avoid turning this into a simple story of heroes and villains. The historical power of Chosin comes from the collision of human endurance, command decisions, national strategy, and environmental extremes. Chinese forces also operated under brutal winter conditions, often with severe logistical challenges of their own. American and United Nations forces faced encirclement pressure, extreme cold, and the urgent need to withdraw in order. The story matters because it shows how strategy can change when the environment punishes every assumption. The road from Udamanai to Hagaru-ri, then toward Koto-ri and Funchilin Pass, became more than a route south. It became the physical line between isolation and survival. Every hill, bridge, convoy, aircraft drop, and command post carried meaning because the entire force had to keep moving through a landscape that did not forgive confusion. The Funchilin Pass would later become one of the most dramatic points in the withdrawal, where engineering, air support, and road control became central to the movement south. Beyond the mountains waited Hungnam, the port where evacuation would transform the story from a frozen withdrawal into a wider historical moment. But in the beginning, none of that was certain. The men around Chosin could not see the full future memory being built around them. They faced the immediate world of snow, cold, ridges, roads, maps, signals, trucks, aircraft, and orders that had to be followed in conditions that tested the meaning of discipline. That is why Chosin Reservoir still holds such power in American memory. It shocked the country because it destroyed the belief that the Korean War was almost over. It showed that overconfidence could carry an army deep into terrain where weather, supply lines, and a new enemy intervention could reverse the momentum of an entire campaign. It also showed that a retreat, when carried out under pressure with discipline and endurance, could become a story of survival rather than simple defeat. The frozen road out of North Korea would become part of Marine Corps memory, Korean War history, and the larger American understanding of what happens when strategy meets mountains in winter. The story begins in that cold realization. The war had not ended at the edge of victory. It had frozen around the men who now had to fight their way back to the sea. The confidence that carried United Nations command forces into North Korea did not feel reckless at first. To many leaders watching the campaign in late 1950, it felt like momentum finally doing what months of crisis had demanded. After the landing at Incheon and the recovery of Seoul, the war seemed to have turned with stunning speed. What had begun as a desperate defense in South Korea had become a drive northward, and the idea that the conflict might be brought to a close before the end of the year entered military briefings, political conversations, and public expectation. Maps encouraged that belief. Lines moved north. Ports opened. Roads were marked. Objectives appeared reachable. The enemy seemed to be falling back. The possibility of reunifying Korea under friendly control seemed, for a moment, less like a distant hope and more like an approaching result. But the mountains of North Korea were not shaped by optimism. They were shaped by distance, weather, narrow roads, steep ridges, and the hard limits of supply. The deeper the advance moved, the more every mile stretched the system that had to support it. United States 10th Corps moved into northeastern Korea as part of this larger advance, and the 1st Marine Division under Major General Oliver P. Smith was ordered inland toward the Chosin Reservoir region, a place few Americans back home had ever heard of and even fewer could imagine clearly. On a map, the route looked like a road into the interior. In reality, it was a frozen corridor. Through mountains, with limited ways in, limited ways out, and very little room for error once winter tightened its grip. The Marines did not move through an open plain where vehicles could spread out and reinforcements could easily arrive from several directions. They moved along mountain roads where the surrounding terrain controlled speed, spacing, communication, and response. A convoy could become stretched by curves, grades, ice, stalled vehicles, and weather. Units could be separated not only by miles, but by the difficulty of moving those miles in sub-zero conditions. Every truck, fuel can, radio, bridge, and supply point mattered because the road itself was becoming the backbone of survival. American assumptions about the enemy also shaped the danger. Many within the larger command structure believed that Chinese involvement, if it came, would be limited or could be managed. There had been warnings, sightings, and contact that suggested Chinese forces were already present in North Korea, but the full scale and intention of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army were not yet understood with the force that hindsight gives us. The record suggests that intelligence was uncertain, command interpretations varied, and optimism at higher levels remained strong enough to keep the advance moving. This uncertainty mattered because an army advancing into difficult terrain must know not only where it is going, but what kind of pressure may be waiting there. In the Chosin region, that pressure was being prepared by Chinese forces under General Song Shirluan's 9th Army, which moved through the mountains with the purpose of striking exposed United Nations positions and challenging the assumption that the war was nearly finished. To write this history responsibly, it is important not to turn the Chinese movement into a mystery tale or a caricature. It was a strategic intervention within a widening war, shaped by China's fears, regional politics, and the approach of United Nations forces toward the border. But for the Marines moving up the long mountain road, the result was the same. The deeper they went, the more dangerous separation became. Major General Oliver P. Smith's caution stood out because he did not treat the road to Chosin as a simple route on paper. Historians often describe Smith as careful, methodical, and skeptical of moving too quickly without adequate support. His division's progress was slower than some higher commanders wanted, but that caution helped preserve a chain of positions and support points that would later prove critical. Smith understood that in that landscape, speed could create gaps, and gaps could become vulnerabilities. The Marines needed supply dumps, airfields or landing strips, road security, communication links, and organized movement between key points. Hagaru-ri, Koto-ri, and Udamanai were not just places where units happened to be located. They became anchors in a system that had to hold together under pressure. If Hagaru-ri could function as a hub, air support and supply could help sustain the division. If Koto-ri remained connected to the road south, movement toward the coast remained possible. If Udamanai could be supported and then linked back into the withdrawal, the force had a chance to remain a force rather than become a collection of isolated groups in the snow. The American confidence of the period depended heavily on air power, and with reason. United States air support had been one of the great advantages of the campaign. Aircraft could observe, strike, deliver supplies, evacuate the wounded, and keep commanders connected to a larger system beyond the mountains. But air power also depended on conditions. Weather could close in. Landing strips had to be created or maintained. Supplies dropped from above still had to be recovered on the ground. Aircraft could help a force survive, but they could not turn a narrow frozen mountain road into an easy highway. The cold itself created problems that air support could not completely solve. Engines resisted starting. Metal became painful to touch. Batteries weakened. Medical care became harder. Food, water, fuel, and movement all became more complicated. In parts of the Chosin campaign, the cold was not background atmosphere. It was an active force in every decision. It slowed hands, stiffened clothing, froze ground, and made ordinary tasks feel like tests of endurance. For American viewers, the easiest way to understand the danger is to imagine a large force moving through a mountain pass in winter, dependent on one main road, while its supply line stretches backward for many miles, and the enemy is not where headquarters hoped he would be, but already moving in the hills around the route. That was the danger growing around Chosin. The Marines were not placed in a dangerous position because one single mistake happened in one single moment. They were placed there by the accumulation of assumptions. That the war was nearly over, that the enemy was too weakened or too limited to reverse the advance, that air support could compensate for distance, that the terrain could be crossed before winter became decisive, and that the movement of different United Nations forces could remain coordinated across a harsh and divided landscape. Each assumption had some logic when viewed separately. Together, in the mountains of northeastern Korea, they created risk. 10th Corps operations were separated from other United Nations forces by geography and command arrangements that made coordination more difficult. The advance on the eastern side of the peninsula did not unfold like a single compact line. It involved movements along separate roads and valleys, with units sometimes far apart and dependent on narrow routes through mountainous terrain. The 1st Marine Division was part of that system, but Smith's command instincts pushed against the danger of being stretched too thin too quickly. He built positions, maintained support points, and moved with more caution than the optimistic mood of the campaign might have encouraged. That difference would matter because once Chinese pressure intensified, the Marines would need every piece of organization they had preserved. General Song Shirluan's 9th Army, meanwhile, represented the other side of the changing war. Chinese forces entered the mountains under conditions that were also severe. They faced cold, supply challenges, and difficult terrain, yet their arrival shifted the entire strategic picture. The war was no longer a pursuit of a retreating enemy toward a likely end. It became a confrontation with a major new force capable of creating pressure across the frozen landscape. The shock for America came partly from this reversal of expectation. A campaign that had been described in tones of approaching success suddenly became a story of survival in a place most Americans could barely locate. The road toward the reservoir had become a trap, not because it was impossible to travel, but because it offered so few alternatives once pressure closed around it. The mountains limited choice. The weather punished delay. The distance made reinforcement difficult. The road south would eventually become the only path that mattered. At this stage of the story, the Marines had not yet entered the full crisis that would define Chosin in American memory. But the conditions for that crisis were already in place. United Nations confidence had carried the campaign deep into North Korea. 10th Corps had moved through a difficult theater where coordination and supply were fragile. The 1st Marine Division had advanced along a long mountain road toward a frozen reservoir. Major General Oliver P. Smith had tried to preserve the structure his division would need if events turned against them. General Song Shirluan's Chinese 9th Army was bringing pressure into the same region. The weather was worsening. The terrain was narrowing. The assumptions behind the advance were beginning to meet the reality of winter, distance, and intervention. The story had not yet become the famous withdrawal, but the road toward that withdrawal was already being built by decisions, geography, and cold. What looked from afar like the final phase of a winning campaign was becoming, mile by mile, the beginning of a survival test that would force America to rethink what victory, retreat, and endurance could mean in the mountains of Korea. Major General Oliver P. Smith entered the Chosin campaign as a commander who understood that speed on a map could become danger on a mountain road. By late November 1950, the confidence around the United Nations advance had not disappeared, but it was being tested by conditions that looked very different from the broad arrows moving north on headquarters maps. The 1st Marine Division was pushing into a region where distance, weather, road security, and supply all mattered as much as the next objective. Smith's caution became important because he did not treat the movement toward the reservoir as a simple pursuit. He saw that a Marine division in northeastern Korea could not survive on momentum alone. It needed structure. It needed connected positions. It needed supply points, communication links, road control, and the ability to receive help from the air if the mountain road became threatened. That kind of command style did not look dramatic in the moment. It looked slow, careful, and sometimes frustrating to those who wanted the advance to move faster. But in the frozen landscape around Chosin, caution was not weakness. It was preparation for a crisis that had not yet fully revealed itself. Smith's responsibility was not only to move his Marines forward. It was to make sure they could still move if the campaign turned against them. That distinction would become one of the central reasons the story did not end in simple collapse. Marine discipline was the human foundation of that effort. The 1st Marine Division was trained to operate under pressure, but training alone does not defeat winter, isolation, and uncertainty. Discipline had to become visible in small actions: maintaining vehicles, guarding roads, preserving communication, building positions, organizing supply dumps, and keeping units from spreading so far apart that they could not support one another. In conditions around the Chosin Reservoir, even ordinary military routines became difficult. The cold reached into engines, batteries, water containers, weapons, clothing, and exposed skin. Men had to think about warmth, fuel, food, ammunition, movement, and rest as parts of the same survival problem. Equipment designed to function in harsh conditions could still struggle when temperatures fell far below freezing. Trucks were not just transportation, they were lifelines. Radios were not just devices, they were the nervous system of the division. A road was not just a route, it was the only line through which the force could remain connected. Smith's caution recognized this reality. He knew that if the Marines advanced too far too quickly without secure points behind them, the division could become stretched across a frozen corridor with too many exposed links. That risk shaped his decisions around Hagaru-ri, the small settlement near the southern end of the reservoir that would become one of the most important places in the campaign. Hagaru-ri mattered because it could serve as a hub, a place to organize movement, receive supplies, coordinate air support, and hold the road network together. Preparing an airfield, there was not a minor technical detail. It was a strategic act. In a remote mountain environment, a usable airstrip meant more than convenience. It meant the possibility of bringing in supplies when roads were threatened. It meant medical evacuation. It meant a direct connection to the larger United States air and naval support system. It meant that the division would not be entirely dependent on trucks climbing icy roads through hostile terrain. The record suggests that Smith's insistence on preparation at Hagaru-ri became one of the choices that later gave the Marines a better chance to endure the crisis. At the time, however, this kind of preparation may not have looked heroic. It looked like construction, planning, bulldozing frozen ground, organizing engineers, arranging supply, and protecting an exposed position in bitter weather. Yet history often turns on details that seem ordinary before the crisis arrives. A landing strip, a fuel stockpile, a guarded road junction, a functioning radio net, a command post that can still operate in the cold. These things can decide whether a unit remains a unit when pressure closes in. Smith also understood that road security could not be separated from supply planning. The Marine route through Udamanai, Hagaru-ri, Koto-ri, and the road south toward Funchilin Pass was long, narrow, and vulnerable. In a different landscape, a division might shift routes, spread out, or receive reinforcement from several directions. Around Chosin, choices were much more limited. The mountains pressed close. Snow and ice slowed movement. Bridges and curves controlled the speed of convoys. If one section of road became blocked, the entire system could be affected. This is why Smith's advance was more deliberate than some expected. He wanted positions strong enough to protect movement, and he wanted supply points that could support the division if the situation changed. It was a command style built around the possibility that high confidence might be wrong. The quiet signs of danger were already there. Reports of Chinese forces had increased. The weather was worsening. The distances between United Nations units remained troubling. The mountains created uncertainty because they could hide movement, limit visibility, and delay response. The enemy did not have to appear in one clear, unmistakable moment to create danger. Danger could build through silence, scattered reports, sudden contacts, missing information, and the uneasy feeling that the map did not show everything happening in the hills. General Song Shiluan's Chinese Ninth Army was moving into the wider region, and although American commanders did not fully grasp the scale and timing of the pressure at every level, the conditions for a major shock were coming together. Smith's caution did not mean he knew every detail of what was coming. It meant he respected what could happen when a force advanced through winter mountains while depending on a narrow road and uncertain intelligence. Communication became another critical part of the story. In the cold around Chosin, communication was not simply a matter of giving orders. It was the way the division understood itself. Commanders needed to know where units were, what roads were open, what supplies remained, where aircraft could operate, where engineers were needed, and how weather was affecting movement. Radio networks, field telephones, runners, signal equipment, and command posts all carried pieces of the larger picture. When terrain and cold made everything slower, reliable communication became even more valuable. A commander who loses communication in a mountain campaign can lose time, and lost time can become danger. Smith's command system tried to prevent that by keeping important positions connected, and by treating the line of withdrawal as something that had to be prepared before anyone openly called it a withdrawal. That was one of the quiet strengths of the Marine position. Even as the larger campaign still carried the language of advance, Smith's division was building the pieces that would make organized movement possible in either direction. Winter equipment and supply planning were part of the same reality. Parkas, gloves, boots, sleeping gear, vehicle maintenance tools, fuel, rations, medical supplies, and ammunition all became elements of command. The cold did not care about rank or strategy. It tested everyone and everything. Marines had to keep moving while protecting themselves from exposure. Mechanics had to keep vehicles alive in temperatures that punished metal and engines. Supply personnel had to move goods forward while the road grew more dangerous. Air support had to be coordinated with ground needs. Engineers had to think not only about building, but about keeping the road usable under constant pressure from weather and terrain. The division's ability to endure would depend on countless practical actions, repeated day after day, before the world understood the scale of the crisis. This is why Smith's command style deserves close attention. He was not merely a figure standing in front of a map. He represented the discipline of preparation under uncertainty. He understood that confidence from higher command could not warm a frozen road, repair a bridge, clear a traffic jam, or guarantee that separated units could reconnect. He also understood that Marines in the mountains needed more than courage. They needed organization. Courage without fuel, roads, communication, and supply can be wasted by geography. Organization gives courage a shape. Around Hagaru-ri, that shape began to form. Airfield work, supply concentration, road security, command coordination, and the careful spacing of forces across the mountain corridor. As the campaign continued, the warning signs grew harder to dismiss. The Chinese presence was no longer a distant possibility. The weather was no longer an inconvenience. The road was no longer just a path toward an objective. It was becoming the central question of survival. Could the Marines hold the key points? Could supplies keep moving? Could aircraft continue to support them? Could units at Hungnam, Hagaru-ri, and Koto-ri remain connected when pressure increased? Could the division preserve its discipline if the advance turned into a fight to get out? These questions had not yet reached their full force, but they were already present beneath the surface of the campaign. Smith's caution gave the Marines a chance to answer them. The wider command had believed the war might be moving toward conclusion, but in the frozen mountains the story was moving in another direction. The 1st Marine Division was not only advancing into North Korea, it was building the framework of its own survival. Soon, General Song Shiluan's forces would bring the pressure of Chinese intervention fully into the Chosin region, and the careful preparations around the road, the airfield, and the command system would be tested in ways that no briefing room optimism could soften. While Major General Oliver Prince Smith was trying to preserve the structure of the 1st Marine Division along the frozen road toward Chosin Reservoir, Another command system was moving through the mountains with a very different purpose. General Song Shirluan, commander of the Chinese Ninth Army, entered this stage of the Korean War under conditions that were severe even before the full pressure of the campaign was felt. His forces belonged to the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, the formation China used after deciding that the United Nations' advance toward the border had become a danger it could not ignore. To many Americans at the time, the sudden Chinese intervention seemed almost impossible to understand because the larger United Nations campaign had been moving under the belief that the war might be close to ending. But from the Chinese side, the movement into North Korea was shaped by fear of enemy forces near the frontier, by strategic urgency, and by a determination to change the direction of the war before the advance became irreversible. Song Shirluan's role should not be treated as a shadowy figure from a simple enemy story. He was a commander operating inside a harsh military and political situation, responsible for moving a large force through mountains, cold, limited roads, and difficult supply conditions in order to place pressure on United Nations positions near Chosin Reservoir. The record suggests that the Chinese Ninth Army faced enormous hardship in the same landscape that would later test the Marines. The cold did not belong to one side. It reached across the ridges, froze equipment, slowed movement, and turned ordinary needs into serious problems. Chinese forces moved with lighter supply arrangements than the American and United Nations forces, and that created its own strain. Food, winter clothing, ammunition, medical care, and transportation were all limited by distance, terrain, and weather. Many Chinese units had to move at night, using concealment, silence, and the cover of the mountains to approach the extended United Nations positions without fully revealing the scale of their presence. This method created surprise, but it also demanded intense endurance. Night marches through steep ground in bitter cold were not effortless. They required discipline, coordination, and the ability to keep moving even when the environment itself punished every step. For Song Shirluan, the mountain campaign was therefore not only a question of ordering pressure against an enemy. It was a question of whether his army could arrive, coordinate, and sustain itself long enough to turn the American advance into a crisis. This is what made the Chosin region so dangerous. The mountains gave concealment to those who knew how to use them, but they also punished the forces moving through them. Ravines, ridges, narrow trails, frozen ground, and snow-covered routes made large-scale movement difficult to detect and difficult to supply. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army used the landscape to hide its approach, but hiding a force in winter mountains is not the same as supplying it comfortably. The same terrain that allowed surprise also limited the movement of food, ammunition, and support. The same cold that weakened American vehicles and radios also exposed Chinese troops to terrible hardship. A balanced documentary has to keep both realities in view. The Chinese Ninth Army brought the pressure that would shock the American command, but it brought that pressure through conditions that were punishing for its own men as well. Song Shirluan's plan depended on movement, timing, and the ability to use the American extension against itself. United Nations forces in northeastern Korea were not gathered in one compact mass. They were spread along roads, settlements, and positions linked by limited routes. Utamini, Hagaru-ri, Koto-ri, and the road toward Funchilin Pass formed a fragile chain through a landscape where separation could become danger. Smith's Marines had tried to protect that chain through careful spacing, supply points, airfield preparation, and road security. Song Shirluan's forces aimed to pressure the same chain from the outside, using the mountains to approach positions, challenge the road, and make the American force feel the limits of distance. This is where the campaign became a contest of systems. Smith's system depended on discipline, air supply, communications, engineering, and organized movement along the road. Song Shirluan's system depended on concealment, night movement, encirclement pressure, coordination through difficult terrain, and the ability to create shock before the United Nations command fully understood the scale of the intervention. Neither system was simple. Both were vulnerable to cold. Both depended on people carrying out difficult tasks in conditions that could break routine military planning. But they produced opposite pressures. Smith tried to keep the road open and the division connected. Song Shirluan tried to make that connection harder, narrower, and more costly to maintain. The quiet signs of danger that had appeared in the earlier advance now began to take on a clearer shape. Chinese units were not merely scattered patrols or isolated contacts. They were part of a larger movement entering the mountains around the reservoir. The American assumption that Chinese involvement might remain limited began to collapse as evidence accumulated. Yet uncertainty still mattered. In mountain terrain, information arrives unevenly. A report from one ridge may not explain what is happening several miles away. A contact near one road bend may not reveal the presence of larger formations beyond the next valley. Weather and darkness reduce what can be seen. Radio traffic and command interpretation can lag behind events. This is why the Chinese approach was so unsettling. It did not announce itself through one clean line on a map. It emerged through pressure, reports, gaps in knowledge, and the growing realization that the United Nations advance had entered a space where the enemy had prepared a major response. Song Shirluan's command pressure was also real. He had to coordinate forces moving through extreme conditions, maintain momentum despite supply limitations, and carry out a campaign that relied on timing. If his forces revealed themselves too early, the United Nations command might adjust. If they arrived too late, the chance to surround and pressure the extended positions might weaken. If supply failed, the pressure might lose strength. If the cold overwhelmed movement, coordination could break down. His army's role was not simply to appear in the mountains. It was to use the mountains to change the campaign. That meant reaching positions near the reservoir, challenging the road network, and placing the Marines and other United Nations elements under enough pressure that the advance could no longer continue as planned. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army's movement through the area was therefore both strategic and environmental. It belonged to the Cold War politics of the Korean conflict, but it was executed through frozen ground, hidden trails, night marches, and human endurance. American accounts often remember the shock of being hit by a force whose presence had been underestimated. Chinese accounts emphasize the difficulty and determination of operating in brutal winter conditions against a technologically stronger opponent. A careful documentary should allow both truths to exist without turning the story into propaganda. The important point is that the Chinese Ninth Army changed the nature of the campaign around Chosin Reservoir. The American force was no longer simply advancing into North Korea. It was becoming the target of a coordinated pressure campaign in terrain that made reinforcement difficult, movement slow, and decisions urgent. For Major General Smith, this meant the careful preparations discussed earlier would soon become essential. The airfield work at Hagaru-ri, the effort to keep road security, the supply planning, and the discipline of Marine Command were no longer just prudent measures. They were becoming the tools of survival. For General Song Shirluan, the challenge was to tighten pressure before the Marines could consolidate enough strength to withdraw in order. His forces had to use surprise and terrain while enduring the same cold that made the entire campaign a test of limits. The mountains around Chosin thus became more than scenery. They became the meeting place of two command philosophies under extreme pressure. One side sought to hold connection along a road. The other sought to compress that connection through concealment and encirclement. One side relied heavily on air support and organized logistics. The other sought to overcome its own limited supply conditions through movement, discipline, and surprise. One side feared being cut apart by distance. The other had to close distance without being stopped by exposure, cold, or hunger. As Chinese pressure increased, the reservoir region began to lose the appearance of a remote objective and take on the shape of a trap. Udamanai, Hagaru-ri, and Koto-ri were no longer just points in an advance. They were becoming positions in a frozen struggle for movement itself. The road south would soon become the center of the story because every strategic question would run through it. Could Smith keep the Marines organized? Could Song Shirluan's forces prevent an orderly withdrawal? Could air supply offset terrain and pressure? Could the frozen road remain open long enough for a fighting withdrawal toward the sea? At this stage, the full ordeal had not yet reached its climax, but the balance had changed. The Chinese Ninth Army had moved through the mountains, concealed by terrain and darkness, carrying its own hardships into the campaign. The United Nations advance had met the force that would end the illusion of an easy finish. The cold deepened. The road narrowed. The reservoir closed in. And the survival story that would shock America was no longer approaching from the future. It was already forming around the men in the snow. By the time the pressure around Chosin Reservoir became unmistakable, the campaign had already changed from an advance into North Korea into a test of whether an extended force could keep its shape under extreme conditions. The trap was not a single visible wall closing in all at once. It was a combination of mountains, weather, distance, limited roads, Chinese Ninth Army pressure, uncertain information, and the realization that the route south now mattered more than any original objective. For the Marines and attached United Nations forces near the reservoir, the map no longer looked like a series of positions in a forward movement. It looked like a chain that had to survive being pulled from every direction. Udamanai, Hagaru-ri, Koto-ri, and the road toward Funchilin Pass became more than place names. They became the structure of survival. If those points could remain connected, the force could withdraw in order. If the road failed, the entire situation could become far more dangerous. Major General Oliver Prince Smith had understood the danger of stretched movement earlier than many observers appreciated, and now his caution began to look less like hesitation and more like preparation. The airfield work at Hagaru-ri, the supply planning, the road security, and the careful effort to keep the division organized were no longer background details. They were the difference between a retreat that could be controlled and a retreat that might dissolve under pressure. General Song Shirluan's Chinese Ninth Army had helped create the conditions that forced this change. Through concealment, night movement, mountain approaches, and pressure against separated positions, Chinese forces made it clear that the United Nations advance could not continue as originally imagined. The shock was not only that Chinese troops were present in greater strength than expected. The deeper shock was that the entire battlefield had been redefined. The Marines were not simply facing an opposing force. They were facing an opposing force in a place where the cold slowed everything. The roads allowed few alternatives, and the surrounding mountains could make distance feel larger than it looked on paper. The trap around the reservoir became clear when the old assumption of forward momentum no longer answered the basic questions of the moment. How could the Marines keep units connected? How could supplies reach the right places? How could vehicles move on frozen mountain roads? How could commanders maintain communication when weather, terrain, and pressure all worked against them? How could air support be used effectively when the ground situation kept shifting and every supply drop had to matter? These were not abstract questions. They shaped each hour of command. The cold changed the meaning of every decision. In warmer conditions, a stalled vehicle might be a delay. Around Chosin, it could become a problem for the entire column. In ordinary weather, moving a supply point might be routine. In sub-zero conditions, it became a contest against ice, darkness, exhaustion, and limited daylight. A radio battery, an engine, a canteen, a pair of gloves, a landing strip, a bulldozer, a bridge, and a stretch of road all became part of the same survival equation. The Marines had entered the region as part of an advance, but they now had to think like a force preserving movement under encirclement pressure. That is why the word retreat can mislead viewers if it is not explained carefully. This was not a simple collapse. It was a disciplined fight for survival, organized around keeping units together, protecting the road, using air support, and refusing to let pressure break the division into disconnected pieces. The famous idea that the Marines were attacking in another direction captured the attitude of the force, but the practical reality behind it was command discipline. To get out, they had to remain organized. To remain organized, they had to hold the road. To hold the road, they needed supply, communication, engineering, air support, and leadership that could keep men moving through a landscape that punished confusion. Major General Smith's task became one of controlled movement. He could not simply order a withdrawal and assume the mountains would allow it. A large force moving down a narrow frozen road needed timing, traffic control, security, supplies, and coordination between units at different points along the route. Hagaru-ri became central because it offered a place where the Marines could gather, receive air support, organize evacuation, and prepare the next movement south. The airstrip there was one of the clearest examples of why preparation mattered. Aircraft could bring in supplies and take out those who needed urgent evacuation, but the airfield itself had to be built, maintained, defended, and used under terrible conditions. Air support became more than a military advantage. It became a lifeline linking the men in the mountains to a wider system beyond the frozen road. Yet even air support had limits. Supplies arriving from above still had to be collected, sorted, and moved. Aircraft depended on weather and visibility. Ground commanders still had to hold enough space for the air connection to function. Air power could help the force survive, but it could not remove the mountains or soften the cold. The single mountain road became the central character of the campaign. It carried trucks, artillery, supplies, wounded men needing care, command vehicles, engineers, and units trying to stay connected. It wound through steep terrain where curves, bridges, icy grades, and narrow passes could control the pace of the entire withdrawal. A road like that does not forgive disorder. If vehicles crowd too tightly, movement slows. If gaps become too large, parts of the force can feel isolated. If the road surface breaks down or a bridge becomes unusable, the column faces a crisis that spreads backward and forward at the same time. This is why Funchilin Pass would later become so important. It was not just a geographic obstacle. It was a test of whether engineering and air support could keep the route open when every minute mattered. But before the pass became the focus, the Marines had to confront the fact that the road itself was now the line of life. Every mile south had to be earned through coordination rather than panic. The Chinese Ninth Army, under Song Shirluan, applied pressure designed to make that coordination harder. The goal was not only to confront the Marines at one place, but to threaten the connections between places. When a force depends on a road, pressure against the road can be as powerful as pressure against a position. Chinese movement through the surrounding mountains created a sense that the terrain itself had turned against the extended United Nations force. Yet the Chinese side also faced severe hardship. Their supply conditions were limited, the cold was punishing, and sustaining pressure in that environment required extraordinary endurance. A balanced account must recognize that the Chosin campaign was not fought in comfort by anyone. The weather was a force pressing on both sides, but it affected them in different ways. American forces had greater access to air support, vehicles, and supply systems, yet those systems became fragile in the mountains. Chinese forces used concealment and movement, yet their own logistical conditions were harsh. The result was a campaign where survival depended not only on strength, but on whether each side could keep functioning under conditions that strained human limits. For the Marines, the beginning of the withdrawal revealed the difference between being surrounded and being helpless. Encirclement pressure created danger, but it did not automatically decide the outcome. The Marines still had command structure. They still had discipline. They still had aircraft overhead when conditions allowed. They still had engineers, vehicle crews, radio operators, corpsmen, officers, and enlisted men carrying out tasks that kept the division alive as a moving force. The challenge was to turn all of that into motion. A stationary force in the mountains could be squeezed. A disorganized force on the road could be broken apart by weather and distance. But an organized force, moving under command, using fire support without dwelling on spectacle, protecting its route, and keeping its columns together, could still survive. This is where the story begins to change. Emotionally, the earlier confidence of the advance had been shattered, but something else replaced it: the determination to make the withdrawal itself an act of discipline. Americans later remembered Chosin not because the campaign went according to plan, but because it did not, and because the Marines still found a way to preserve order under conditions that seemed built for collapse. In the command posts, maps no longer represented ambition. They represented the next reachable point on the road. Hagaru-ri, Koto-ri, and the southern route became steps in a survival calculation. Reports, supply lists, weather updates, aircraft schedules, road conditions, and unit positions carried enormous weight. Smith's command had to measure what could be held, what had to be moved, when columns could start, where support was needed, and how to keep pressure from turning the withdrawal into chaos. Song Shirluan's forces, meanwhile, continued to press from the surrounding terrain, seeking to exploit the same narrow road and frozen distances that Smith needed to master. The reservoir had become a trap, but not a trap that removed all agency. It became a test of whether preparation, discipline, and endurance could carve a way out. This is the turning point that explains why the story shocked America and why it endured in memory. The United States had expected the Korean War to be nearing conclusion. Instead, its Marines were fighting to move through a frozen corridor in North Korea after the sudden Chinese intervention changed the war's direction. But the shock was paired with a powerful counterimage, a retreat that did not become surrender to the mountains. The force bent, reorganized, and began moving south with purpose. The road was dangerous, the weather was brutal, the pressure was real, and reinforcement was not easy. Yet the withdrawal began to take on the shape of a disciplined survival story. The same cold that exposed overconfidence also revealed the value of command preparation. The same mountains that made the advance dangerous now made organization essential. The same road that trapped the force became the path by which it might survive. And as the Marines began the long movement toward Hagaru-ri, Koto-ri, Funchilin Pass, and eventually the sea, the meaning of the campaign changed again. It was no longer about reaching the northern objective that had seemed possible weeks earlier. It was about keeping an entire force alive, connected, and moving through one of the harshest chapters in American military memory. The withdrawal from Chosin Reservoir became famous because it looked, from a distance, like a force trapped in winter, but from inside the command system it had to be built like a moving fortress. Major General Oliver Prince Smith could not simply tell the Marines and attached United Nations forces to go south and expect the road to carry them. The road was the problem, the lifeline, and the battlefield all at once. It ran through frozen mountains, narrow turns, icy grades, small settlements, damaged sections, and places where a single obstacle could slow an entire column. Every vehicle mattered. Every fuel can mattered. Every radio message mattered. Every supply drop had to be recovered, sorted, and pushed into the movement before time, weather, or pressure took away the chance to use it. This is why the withdrawal did not become a scene of simple panic. It became a disciplined operation under extreme strain, a fighting withdrawal in which the Marines had to move, protect the movement, maintain order, and keep the road open while Chinese Ninth Army pressure under General Song Shirluen continued to shape the danger around them. The men on the road were not escaping across an open landscape. They were moving through a frozen corridor where mountains limited choice and cold turned routine military work into a survival task. In that environment, discipline was not an abstract Marine value. It was the method by which a column kept its shape. Trucks had to be loaded and started in temperatures that punished engines. Drivers had to maintain spacing without losing contact. Engineers had to repair, clear, improvise, and prepare the route ahead. Commanders had to know which units were moving, which were holding, which needed supplies, and which road sections might become critical. Air support had to be coordinated with the movement on the ground, but aircraft could not solve every problem from above. Supplies dropped by parachute were only useful if the right people could reach them, recover them, and get them into the column. Aircraft could help protect movement and bring in essential material, but the Marines still had to move through the snow 1 mile at a time. Hagaru-ri became the heart of this system because it gave the withdrawal a place to breathe. The airfield prepared there under Smith's cautious planning became one of the most important decisions of the campaign. A rough strip in the frozen mountains might not sound dramatic, but in the Chosin story it carried enormous meaning. It allowed aircraft to land, supplies to arrive, and personnel needing urgent care to be moved out. It gave the command a physical link to the wider American support system beyond the mountain road. Without that airfield, the withdrawal would have depended even more heavily on the single ground route, and the margin for survival would have become much smaller. Smith's earlier insistence on building and maintaining support points now showed its value. What had once seemed slow to some observers became a reason the division could continue to function. Hagaru-ri was not only a location. It was a command hub, a supply point, an evacuation center, and a symbol of organized preparation under pressure. From there, the movement south had to be managed as a sequence, not a rush. The force had to gather, reorganize, move by stages, and keep enough strength at each point to prevent the road from becoming unusable. This required a constant balance between staying too long and moving too fast. Stay too long, and pressure could tighten. Move too fast, and vehicles could jam, units could separate, and supplies could be left behind before they were used. Smith's disciplined decisions came from recognizing that a large force in mountains can be endangered by confusion as much as by the enemy. The withdrawal therefore had to preserve rhythm. Units moved, halted, covered one another, cleared obstacles, and pushed south in a pattern shaped by terrain and necessity. The cold never stopped influencing those decisions. It made metal brittle, batteries weak, engines stubborn, and hands slow. Snow and ice affected footing, tires, tracks, and visibility. Fuel and maintenance became as important as any line on the map. A vehicle that could not move was not only a mechanical problem, it could become an obstacle for everything behind it. A bridge that could not be crossed was not only a piece of infrastructure, it could become the difference between connection and isolation. That reality made the Funchilin Pass bridge problem one of the most important moments in the withdrawal. The road south from Koto-ri toward the coast passed through terrain where a broken or unusable bridge could threaten the entire movement. The famous solution involved engineering improvisation and air delivery of bridge sections, showing how the campaign depended on the meeting of ground skill and air support. This was not a simple miracle from the sky. It required planning, accurate delivery, engineers ready to work under harsh conditions, and a column organized enough to reach and use the route. The bridge problem proved the deeper lesson of Chosin. Survival depended on coordination across many systems at once. Air crews, engineers, truck drivers, commanders, communications teams, and Marines on the road all had to fit into one moving effort. If any part failed completely, the whole withdrawal could slow or fracture. General Song Shirluan's Chinese Ninth Army continued to apply pressure against that effort, seeking to make the road harder to hold and the movement harder to sustain. But the Chinese side was also operating in brutal conditions, with its own supply limitations and exposure to the same unforgiving winter. The campaign was not a contest between one side and the cold. It was a contest in which both sides had to endure the cold while trying to impose their plan on the other. Song Shirluan's pressure forced the Marines to keep moving with urgency. Smith's discipline prevented urgency from becoming disorder. That contrast defined this phase of the story. The Chinese strategy aimed to surround, compress, and disrupt the extended United Nations force. The Marine response was to keep the force intact long enough to break through the geography of danger, not by pretending the situation was easy, but by treating movement itself as the main mission. Each stage southward carried its own command burden. Udamanai had to link with Hagaru-ri. Hagaru-ri had to support the next movement toward Koto-ri. Koto-ri had to connect to the route through Funchilin Pass. Funchilin Pass had to remain passable for the column to continue toward the coast. These names became a chain of survival because the withdrawal could only succeed if the chain held. The road became a narrow promise. Stay organized, and movement remains possible. Lose organization, and the mountains decide. For American memory, this is why Chosin became different from a normal retreat. It was not remembered only because the Marines moved away from the reservoir. It was remembered because they moved away while still acting like a disciplined force. They carried equipment, kept vehicles moving where possible, used airdrops, maintained command structure, improvised engineering solutions, and made the road south into a controlled operation under pressure. This is also why Smith's role became so central. His decisions did not remove danger, but they gave the division the structure to face it. He had not trusted the idea that momentum alone could carry the campaign. He had prepared points of support, respected the road, valued communication, and understood that supply endurance might decide whether the division could survive a reversal. When the reversal came, those habits mattered. The withdrawal was therefore both physical and psychological. Physically, it was the movement of men, vehicles, supplies, and command posts through frozen mountains. Psychologically, it was the transformation of a shocking setback into a controlled test of endurance. The Marines had to accept that the campaign's original expectation had collapsed, while refusing to let that collapse define the movement itself. In the snow and cold, the meaning of success changed. Success was no longer reaching the northern objective. Success was keeping the force alive, connected, and moving toward the sea. Success was a truck starting in the cold, a radio message getting through, a bridge section arriving, an airfield functioning, a convoy staying together, an engineer solving the next problem, a commander making the next careful decision, and a unit holding its discipline long enough for the next unit to pass. This was not the kind of victory that appears in simple headlines. It was a victory of organization over chaos, logistics over isolation, and disciplined movement over the pressure of encirclement. The road south remained hard, and the story had not yet reached Hungnam. But by this stage, the character of the withdrawal was clear. It was no longer a question of whether the advance had failed to meet its original hopes. It had. The question was whether the force could turn that failure of expectation into survival. Through frozen roads, airdrops, vehicle columns, engineering improvisation, Hagaru-ri's airfield, the Funchilin Pass bridge solution, and Smith's steady command choices, the Marines began to show why Chosin would be remembered not as a simple collapse, but as a disciplined fight through winter toward the possibility of escape. By the time the withdrawal reached its most compressed stage, the road south had become a narrow test of everything the Marines had preserved since the first signs of danger appeared around Chosin Reservoir. The column was no longer an idea on a map or a general order moving through command channels. It was a physical line of men, vehicles, supplies, engineers, radios, fuel, equipment, and decisions stretched along a frozen mountain road where every delay could affect everything behind it. The surrounding terrain left little room for flexibility. The mountains pressed close. Ice and snow slowed movement. Curves, grades, bridges, and narrow passages controlled the pace of an entire force. The cold continued to make even ordinary tasks difficult, turning the simple act of keeping engines running, radios functioning, and men moving into a command problem. Major General Oliver Prince Smith's disciplined approach now faced its highest test. The withdrawal had to keep moving toward Koto-ri, Chinhung-ani, and eventually Hungnam, but it could not move like a crowd fleeing disorder. It had to move like a force that still understood itself. Each section of the column had a purpose. Some elements protected movement. Some cleared the route. Some moved supplies. Some maintained communication. Some kept vehicles going in conditions that seemed determined to stop them. The pressure from General Song Shirluan's Chinese Ninth Army had reached a decisive stage because the road was the point where all strategic questions converged. If Chinese pressure could slow, divide, or disrupt the column, the mountains and weather would make every problem worse. If the Marines and attached United Nations forces could keep the route open, preserve coordination, and continue south, then the withdrawal could remain a disciplined survival operation rather than become the collapse many feared. Relief depended heavily on air support, but air support was not a magic answer. Aircraft could bring supplies, provide cover, move urgent cases from the airfield, and deliver critical material, yet everything from above still had to connect with the reality on the ground. A supply drop did not help unless it landed where it could be recovered. A bridge component did not matter unless engineers could reach the gap, place it, and make the road usable. Aircraft could help watch over the route, but they could not widen the road or warm the engines. This is why the relationship between air and ground became so important. The withdrawal survived through coordination, not through one single tool. Pilots, engineers, drivers, radio operators, commanders, and Marines moving along the road had to act as parts of the same effort. The Hagaru-ri airfield had given the force a breathing space, but the movement beyond it toward Koto-ri and the southern passes required a different kind of endurance. The column had to pass through terrain where a blocked crossing or damaged bridge could threaten the entire movement. The Funchilin Pass bridge problem became one of the clearest examples of how close the withdrawal came to being decided by engineering and logistics. The route south required a usable crossing, and the solution demanded improvisation under pressure. Bridge sections delivered. By air, engineers prepared to work in extreme cold, and commanders keeping the column organized long enough for the road to be restored. In a simple telling, this could sound like a technical episode. In the real logic of the campaign, it was central. A bridge in the mountains is not only wood, steel, or structure. It is time. It is movement. It is the difference between a column that continues and a column forced into deeper danger. The engineers who kept the route open became as important to the survival of the withdrawal as any dramatic image people later remembered. They worked within the limits of terrain, weather, equipment, and urgency, turning practical skill into strategic survival. At Koto-ri, the command burden remained heavy. The force had to gather itself without losing momentum, reorganize without becoming trapped by delay, and prepare for the next movement south. Smith's decisions had to balance pressure from several directions. Move too slowly, and the surrounding pressure could tighten. Move too quickly, and the column might lose the structure that kept it alive. Leave essential supplies behind too early, and the force could suffer later. Carry too much, and the road could become slower and more fragile. Every choice involved trade-offs, and the cold made those trade-offs sharper. A vehicle that failed in place could slow other vehicles. A radio problem could create confusion. A shortage of fuel or parts could ripple through the column. A delay at one point could reach miles backward into the road. This was why discipline mattered more as the pressure increased, not less. Panic would have been understandable in such conditions, but understandable does not mean survivable. The Marines had to keep moving by routine, order, and command habit. They had to trust the next point on the road, the next order, the next cleared passage, the next air mission, and the next engineering solution. The Chinese Ninth Army continued to test that order. Song Shiluan's forces sought to make the road harder to use and the movement harder to sustain, applying pressure from the surrounding mountains and against key points along the route. The effect was not only physical, but psychological. A column under pressure in winter can begin to feel that the entire landscape is closing. The ridge above, the turn ahead, the bridge below, the radio message that has not arrived, the truck that will not start, the low clouds that threaten air support, the cold that enters every pause. All of it becomes part of the same burden. Yet the Marines and attached forces kept turning that burden into tasks. Secure the road. Move the convoy. Maintain contact. Bring forward supplies. Repair what can be repaired. Use the air connection when weather allows. Keep the column from losing its shape. That practical focus is what made the withdrawal different from a simple story of defeat. The force was under intense pressure, but it was still acting. It was not merely being pushed south. It was conducting a movement that required skill at every level. The road toward Hungnam represented the next step out of the mountain trap and toward the coast. Reaching it did not erase what had happened around the reservoir, but it changed the geometry of danger. The farther the column moved south while still organized, the more the possibility of evacuation at Hungnam became real. Hungnam was not yet the emotional ending, but it had become the destination that gave the road meaning. The sea represented connection to a wider force, ships, supplies, and the possibility of removing troops and civilians from a collapsing position in northeastern Korea. But before Hungnam could become the final stage, the column had to get there. This was the climax of endurance. Not one instant, but a series of decisions that had to succeed in sequence. The Marines had to move from the reservoir area through Hagaru-ri, then Koto-ri, then down the difficult road past Funchilin Pass, toward Hungnam, and finally toward the port. Each move carried risk. Each successful move preserved the force a little longer. Each mile south made survival more possible, but none of it felt automatic. Major General Smith's command style remained central because he understood that the withdrawal had to be controlled all the way to the end. A force can survive the first crisis and still be lost to disorder. In the second, Smith's caution, once questioned by those who wanted faster movement north, now helped keep the movement south from becoming chaotic. He had built support points, respected the road, valued supply, and maintained discipline. In this stage, those choices were no longer theoretical advantages. They were the structure holding the column together. General Song Shiluan's pressure had transformed the campaign and forced the United Nations' advance into retreat, but the decisive American response was to turn retreat into organized survival. The result was a struggle over movement itself. Could Chinese pressure make the road fail before the Marines reached safety? Could Smith's command keep the column coordinated long enough to reach the coast? Could air support and engineers overcome the broken places in the route? Could vehicles, supplies, and men endure the cold long enough for the next stage? The answer emerged gradually, not in one dramatic moment. It emerged in engines that kept running, bridges made usable, air missions coordinated, convoys managed, roads cleared, messages received, and tired men moving one more mile. By the time the force pushed beyond the most dangerous mountain passages and moved toward Hungnam, the meaning of the withdrawal had already changed. America would remember the shock of the sudden Chinese intervention and the frozen retreat, but it would also remember that the Marines did not simply vanish into the mountains. They came out as an organized force because command, logistics, engineering, air support, and discipline held together under conditions that could have shattered them. The road to Hungnam was still ahead, and the evacuation would soon turn the story from a mountain withdrawal into a coastal operation with enormous historical weight. But the climax along the mountain road had proven the central lesson of Chosin. In extreme war, survival can depend less on a single heroic moment than on the ability of an entire force to keep solving the next problem before the cold, the road, and the pressure closed the last way out. When the Marines and attached United Nations forces finally broke out from the Chosin Reservoir area and continued toward the coast, the meaning of the withdrawal changed from immediate survival into national shock. The road south had not carried a defeated crowd out of the mountains. It had carried an organized force through one of the harshest tests of the Korean War. Major General Oliver Prince Smith's division had moved through frozen roads, narrow passes, air supply dependence, engineering improvisation, and continuous pressure while preserving the structure that made movement possible. That was the reason the story became so powerful in American memory. The Marines had been placed in a dangerous position by a campaign that had moved forward under strong confidence, but they did not come out of the mountains as a symbol of simple collapse. They came out as proof that discipline could survive when strategy failed to predict the full reality ahead. The shock in the United States came from two truths arriving at the same time. First, the war was not nearly over. Second, the Chinese intervention was far larger and more decisive than many Americans had understood. Only weeks earlier, the advance into North Korea had seemed to suggest that the conflict might be approaching its final phase. The movement toward the Yalu River had created expectations that victory might be close, that the enemy had been pushed back, and that United Nations command forces could complete their mission before winter took full control of the mountains. Chosin broke that expectation. It showed that the Korean War had widened into a much more dangerous struggle, one shaped not only by North Korea and United Nations forces, but by the massive involvement of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army. General Song Shirluan's Chinese Ninth Army had brought pressure into the Chosin region in a way that transformed the battlefield. The Marines had not merely encountered difficult terrain and bad weather. They had faced a coordinated effort to surround, pressure, and disrupt them along a mountain road where alternatives were few and every mile mattered. For Americans reading reports back home, this was a dramatic reversal. The war that had seemed to be moving toward conclusion suddenly looked open-ended, uncertain, and far more costly in political and military terms. The breakout from Chosin therefore carried more than tactical meaning. It became a national lesson in the limits of overconfident strategy. The United States and its allies had air power, vehicles, communications, naval support, and professional formations, but none of those advantages erased the reality of terrain, weather, distance, and enemy intervention. Around Chosin, a single mountain road could become more important than broad strategic claims. A bridge problem could shape the fate of a column. An airfield at Hagaru-ri could become a lifeline. A convoy's order could matter as much as a line on a map. The cold could turn equipment into a burden and make every pause more dangerous. The story shocked America because it made clear that modern military strength does not guarantee easy control of a campaign when assumptions fail. The Marines broke out because they kept solving practical problems under pressure. They did not escape the reservoir through a single dramatic gesture. They moved south through coordination, air support, road security, command discipline, engineering work, vehicle management, supply endurance, and the ability to keep units connected when the environment itself seemed to pull them apart. Hagaru-ri, Koto-ri, Hungnam, and the road toward Hungnam became a sequence of survival rather than a list of places. Each step mattered because the force had to remain organized long enough to reach the next step. By the time the column moved toward the coast, the retreat had already become a story larger than the mountain road. Hungnam now became central. The port was not only a destination on the map. It was the place where the frozen withdrawal connected to a vast evacuation effort, where military forces, equipment, supplies, and civilians were moved by sea under the pressure of a collapsing position in northeastern Korea. The Hungnam Evacuation gave the Chosin story its final historical frame. The road out of the mountains led to ships, docks, cold wind off the water, crowded movement, military planning, civilian fear, and the enormous task of removing people and material before the enemy pressure could close the coast. It was a different kind of operation from the mountain withdrawal, but it belonged to the same story because it showed how quickly strategic confidence had turned into emergency logistics. The United States had not expected the campaign to end with a major evacuation from a North Korean port. Yet that is what the changed war demanded. Hungnam revealed the scale of the reversal. The advance that once seemed to promise a quick finish had become a withdrawal by land and sea. The mountains had tested discipline. The port tested coordination on an even larger stage. Ships had to be loaded, forces had to be organized, civilians had to be considered, and the evacuation had to happen under intense time pressure. This is why the story cannot be reduced to the word retreat alone. A retreat describes direction. It does not explain meaning. The meaning of Chosin lies in how the force moved, why it had to move, what the movement revealed, and how the consequences reached American public memory. For the Marines, the breakout became part of an identity built around endurance in impossible conditions. The phrase, "the chosen few," would later carry emotional weight because it referred not only to those who had been present, but to the shared memory of cold weather survival, discipline under pressure, and the stubborn refusal to let a terrible situation become complete disorder. For the wider United States, Chosin became a warning against assuming that military momentum equals strategic certainty. The enemy may not be as defeated as believed. A new force may enter the war. Weather may change the meaning of every plan. Supply lines may become fragile. A road may become the center of a campaign. The Marines' breakout showed strength, but the need for that breakout showed the danger of overconfidence. Major General Smith's role in this payoff remains essential. He did not control every decision that placed the Marines deep in the mountains, and he did not make the wider assumptions that shaped the United Nations advance. But within the crisis, his cautious command style helped turn withdrawal into organization. His attention to supply, spacing, airfield preparation, road security, and disciplined movement gave the 1st Marine Division tools it needed when the campaign shifted from advance to survival. General Song Shirluan's role is equally important to understanding the shock. His Chinese Ninth Army applied the pressure that proved the war had changed. It showed that Chinese intervention was not symbolic or limited in the way some had hoped. It was a major strategic reality. A balanced view should also recognize that Chinese forces operated under severe winter hardship and limited supply conditions of their own. The Chosin campaign was a collision of human endurance on both sides, shaped by commands trying to impose plans on a landscape that punished everyone. But the American memory of the battle focused especially on the men who came out of the frozen mountains and the realization that the war had entered a far more dangerous phase. At Hungnam, the consequences became visible to the world. The evacuation showed that United Nations forces were not simply adjusting a front line. They were extracting an entire position from northeastern Korea after the Chinese intervention had changed the strategic map. The port became a symbol of urgency, scale, and transition. From the frozen reservoir to the coast, the story moved from encirclement pressure to organized withdrawal, from mountain road to evacuation fleet, from battlefield crisis to national reckoning. The shock came because America had to absorb a hard lesson. Victory in Korea would not be quick, simple, or guaranteed by confidence after Incheon. The war would continue, and it would continue under conditions far more complicated than the optimistic expectations of autumn 1950. That is why the Chosin Reservoir story endured. It combined the fear of being trapped with the discipline of breaking out. It combined technological strength with the humility forced by weather and terrain. It combined the pride of Marine endurance with the sobering recognition that strategy had underestimated the scale of Chinese intervention. It showed that retreat can sometimes become the truest test of an army, not because moving backward is glorious by itself, but because moving backward in order, under pressure, through frozen mountains, while keeping a force alive and connected, demands a rare kind of discipline. By the time the Marines reached the road toward Hungnam and the evacuation took shape, the story had already answered the question that made it unforgettable. It shocked America because it shattered the belief that the war was nearly won. It became remembered because, inside that shock, the Marines turned a dangerous withdrawal into a lasting symbol of cold weather survival, command discipline, logistical endurance, and the hard limits of any strategy that forgets what mountains, winter, and a determined enemy can do. Chosin Reservoir is remembered not only because men moved through a frozen mountain corridor under enormous pressure, but because the campaign changed how Americans understood the Korean War itself. Before the crisis, much of the public imagination had been shaped by movement, recovery, and the hope that the conflict might soon end. After the Marines and attached United Nations forces broke out from the reservoir area and reached the evacuation at Hungnam, the war looked different. It no longer seemed like a campaign approaching a clean finish. It had become a hard lesson in limited war, enemy intervention, winter warfare, political uncertainty, and the danger of believing that battlefield momentum can answer every strategic question. For the United States, Chosin became a shock because it revealed how quickly confidence could be overturned by geography, weather, and a major Chinese intervention. The same country that had watched the dramatic success of Incheon now had to absorb images and reports of Marines withdrawing through sub-zero mountains, relying on air support, engineers, supply discipline, and command order to keep the force intact. The story unsettled Americans because it showed that the Korean War was not a short march toward victory. It was a conflict shaped by regional fears, Cold War pressures, and limits that even a powerful military could not ignore. Major General Oliver Prince Smith became central to that memory because his command style gave the story a shape that Americans could understand. He did not represent reckless ambition. He represented caution, discipline, preparation, and the ability to keep a division organized when the larger campaign's assumptions failed. The airfield at Hagaru-ri, the road security, the supply planning, the management of columns, and the coordination toward Koto-ri, Shinhung-ni, and Hungnam all became part of the larger explanation for why the withdrawal did not become a simple collapse. General Song Shirluan and the Chinese Ninth Army also remain essential to the historical meaning. Their pressure around the reservoir proved that Chinese involvement was not a minor episode. It was a decisive change in the war's direction. From China's perspective, the intervention was tied to fears about United Nations forces approaching the border and to the belief that the war in Korea had become a direct threat to Chinese security. From the American perspective, it felt like a sudden widening of the conflict, a reversal that arrived in the frozen mountains and reshaped public understanding. A balanced view has to recognize that the Chinese forces also endured extreme cold, difficult terrain, and severe supply limitations. The human cost of the campaign belonged to both sides, even though each side remembered it through different national stories. For South Korea, Chosin was part of a wider struggle for survival during a war that had already devastated the peninsula. The withdrawal from the reservoir and the Hungnam Evacuation were not only military events. They were connected to civilians, families, displacement, and the uncertain future of a divided country. The evacuation from Hungnam carried profound meaning because it showed the war moving beyond battlefield lines into the lives of ordinary people who needed escape from a rapidly changing front. South Korea would later remember the Korean War as a national catastrophe and a foundation of survival, sacrifice, and statehood under extraordinary pressure. Chosin fit into that memory as one of the moments when the war's scale became unmistakable. For North Korea, the campaign belonged to a different narrative, one tied to resistance against United Nations forces and the intervention of Chinese troops that helped push the war away from the northern border region. North Korean memory would interpret the war through its own ideological lens, but the historical fact remains that the Chosin campaign helped prevent the United Nations advance from ending the war on the terms many American leaders had hoped for in late 1950. The result was not a final settlement. It was a prolonged conflict that eventually stabilized around division rather than reunification. That outcome shaped the Cold War for decades. Chosin became one of the early warnings that wars in Asia during the Cold War would not always fit the expectations of American planners. The United States had overwhelming industrial capacity, advanced aircraft, naval power, and global reach, but Korea showed that those strengths did not automatically produce unlimited political results. Fighting near another major power's border could trigger intervention. Advancing too far too quickly could create strategic risk. Air power could sustain a force, but it could not erase mountains. Mechanized movement could carry troops deep into hostile terrain, but it could also depend on roads that could be blocked, frozen, or broken. Limited war meant that military power had to operate under political restraints, diplomatic risks, alliance concerns, and the danger of escalation. Chosin helped teach that lesson early, before later American debates over wars in Asia made it even more familiar. For the Marine Corps, the campaign became part of institutional identity. The memory of the chosen few came to represent endurance, brotherhood, cold weather survival, and disciplined movement under pressure. Marine Corps memory did not treat Chosin as a simple defeat because the Marines came out as an organized force, carrying with them the proof that discipline could survive a catastrophic reversal of strategy. That identity was built around practical virtues, keeping units connected, holding the road, supporting one another, improvising under pressure, using air supply effectively, and refusing to let the cold or the surrounding pressure destroy the structure of command. The phrase often associated with the campaign, that they were attacking in another direction, captured a spirit of defiance, but the deeper lesson was more grounded. Survival came from organization. Pride came from endurance. Memory came from the fact that the withdrawal was controlled enough to become a symbol rather than a disappearance into the mountains. Still, a humane reflection must avoid turning suffering into legend without context. Chosin was not only a story of courage. It was also a story of miscalculation, harsh command realities, freezing weather, uncertainty, and ordinary people placed inside decisions made at levels far above them. It asks viewers to think about what strategy means when it reaches the ground. A plan may begin with maps, arrows, conferences, and promises, but it becomes real through roads, bridges, fuel, food, radios, boots, weather, and the physical endurance of human beings. Around Chosin, every large idea became a small practical problem. Cold War containment became a road through the mountains. Chinese intervention became pressure on a convoy. Air superiority became a supply drop that had to land where someone could recover it. Command discipline became the difference between a force that could still move and a force that could not. That is why the campaign remains powerful for modern audiences. It explains the Korean War not as a forgotten conflict, but as a war filled with lessons about limits. For later American understanding of Asia, Chosin stood as an early example of how difficult it can be to impose a political outcome in a region where nationalism, alliances, outside intervention, geography, and ideology all interact. It did not predict every later conflict, and it should not be forced into a simple comparison with other wars. But it did warn that American power could face severe limits when strategy underestimated local conditions, enemy determination, and the risk of escalation. The story also reminds viewers that retreat is not always the opposite of discipline. Sometimes retreat is the form discipline must take when survival, preservation of force, and strategic reality demand it. The Marines who moved south from Chosin did not erase the shock of the Chinese intervention. They did not turn the wider war into victory. They did not remove the tragedy of a divided Korea or the suffering that continued after the evacuation. But they did demonstrate that even when a campaign's expectations collapse, a force can still preserve order, protect its people, and create a path out of danger through command, logistics, and endurance. That is the lasting human meaning of Chosin Reservoir, and it is why this story has to be explained clearly rather than remembered only as a frozen retreat. For an American audience, the word retreat can sound like a simple failure, but Chosin shows something far more complex. American forces advanced deep into North Korea because confidence after Incheon made victory seem close. Yet the mountains, winter, distance, and the scale of Chinese intervention revealed how dangerous that confidence had become. General Song Sherluin's Chinese Ninth Army pressure changed the battlefield, while Major General Oliver Prince Smith's command discipline helped turn a dangerous withdrawal into an organized fight for survival. The airfield at Hagaru-ri, the road through Koto-ri, the engineering challenge at Funchilin Pass, the airdrops, the frozen vehicle columns, and the movement toward Hungnam all show that this was not a collapse into panic. It was a fighting withdrawal shaped by logistics, command, endurance, and the hard limits of strategy in a limited war. Chosin shocked America because it shattered the belief that the Korean War was nearly over. It endured in Marine Corps identity because the withdrawal became a symbol of disciplined survival. It mattered to South Korea, China, and North Korea because it changed the direction of the war. It mattered to Cold War history because it showed that power near the borders of great powers can trigger consequences no planner can ignore. And it still matters today because it reminds us that the harshest lessons in war are often learned not in moments of easy victory, but on roads where people must keep moving through cold, uncertainty, and the weight of history.